Today is Monday, February 24th, 2025, and this is Spring Office Hours, Season 4, Episode 6, Spring Modulith with Cora Iberkleid. My name is Dan Vega, Spring Developer Advocate at Broadcom, joined by my good friend and colleague, DaShaun Carter. DaShaun, how's it going?
It's wonderful. It's a Monday, beautiful. The weather's finally turning around. We've had some cold days. Last week we only had one day of school. It was that cold that it was below zero for the first 4 days of the week, and now it's finally nice. So I've been outside. I've gone for a run. I've already done my swim for the day. Things are trending in the right direction, and it's a whole lot easier to do spring when you feel good, right? When the kids aren't distracting you, it's a whole lot easier to be productive.
When
all the other things fall into place.
Spring in the springtime is coming.
Spring in the spring. This is the best time to do it.
It's getting nice over here too, but I get to leave tomorrow to go to wonderful, sunny, maybe not so much, Montreal, Canada. So I'm leaving the warmer weather and going to colder weather. So not that much fun, but really looking forward to it. Heading to Confu tomorrow. So I love that conference. Going to have some fun there tomorrow. So
fantastic. That's going to be a good one. That's going to be
a busy couple weeks. Next week we're both going to be in person. We get to do a live podcast from DevNexus. That's going to be a lot of fun. We don't get to do many of those, so when we do, it's a lot of fun.
Absolutely. It's going to DevNexus is going to be pretty hot this year. It's going to be nice. There's a lot of really good presentations.
Yep. It should be a good time. What else has been going on?
What else? I mean, the home lab. I got more hardware. I got to present to the Kenya Java user group on Saturday. That was fun. We had about 100, I think, show up. It was great questions. I didn't get through my agenda. Kind of typical me. But we had great questions, great follow-ups, and it was good, right? We ended up going down the native image stuff, which is always fun, and it makes sense, right? If you don't have cloud money, you're not doing the let me stand up 5 data centers in 5 different regions. If you're not doing that just yet, then the native images, they go a long way. So yeah.
And that was to the newest Java user group, correct?
The newest Java user group. Yes.
All right.
Is the Kenya Java user group.
Cool. All right. Well, we're going to have some fun today. We are going to talk about Spring Modulith. We're going to talk about monoliths and microservices and all that fun stuff. But before we do so, if you are joining us live, which I see a lot of our friends are here today, this is great to see. If you're joining us live, make sure you get your questions in. If we can't answer them, we know our special guest can. So please get those questions in. And if you are not here on the live stream, you can catch the replay on the Spring Developer YouTube channel. We also will turn this into a podcast, so you can take us on the run or on a swim, wherever
you can. And just a reminder, my parents are always watching, and my parents, they really enjoy seeing where everybody is joining us from. There's Ian from the Kenya Java user group. Look at that. Oh, and he's inviting you to come and talk about Spring AI.
That would be awesome. Let's find a good time and let's do that. So.
Yeah, they do theirs on Saturday, so easy peasy, easy to find that time. But yeah, let us know where you're joining from, because my mom and dad are always watching. And look at this, we got quite the crowd. Felipe's here, Ian's here, Spencer's in the building. This is great.
Oh man,
thank you. Greetings from Germany.
Oh, speaking of, before we get to our special guest, Felipe, I believe gave you a book. And you gave
I gave it away on Thursday at the Kansas City Java user group.
I have 2 books. I am selfishly keeping one for myself. Thank you, Felipe. But
as did I.
I'll be giving one away next week at DevNexus. And to get that book, you have to come by and check out our live viewing of the Spring Office Hours podcast. And at the end, I'll ask a question that we might have done, something relevant to that we talked about during that broadcast. And if you can answer it, the book's yours. So what's the title of that book again? I know it's Kotlin and Spring, but
it's Pro Spring Boot 3 with Kotlin.
Nice. So yes, thank you, Felipe, for that. And definitely looking forward to giving that one away. All right, with that, I'm going to bring on our special guest today, our friend, our colleague, the one and only Cora Iberkleid. Cora.
It's
How's
so
it going?
Thank you for having me here.
Oh, thanks for joining us. This should be a lot of fun. Now, we know you. We get to work with you every day. But for those who don't know the great Cora, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm also a developer advocate on the same team as DaShaun and Dan. It's been a real pleasure to be on this team. I think this is year 5, crazy enough.
Wow.
Yeah. So I started 2020. And before that, I had I come from more of a career of uh, consulting and pre-sales and even tech support if I go a little further back. So it's been, you know, I'm just having fun. I feel like I somehow fell into this field and it's just been one fun thing after another. And now, like, every time something cool, so there's like some evolution in technology, you feel like I'm so lucky to be here. And now it's like, it's insane right now how many things
Yeah.
how many exciting things are happening. So yeah, it's just happy to be part of this fun journey that we're all on.
Yeah, and for anyone who likes to learn, this is a great field to be in
Yes.
because you are always given a new opportunity to learn something. I feel like, obviously there's like kind of mundane tasks that you have to go through when you have a job, right? Like filling out expense reports is never fun. But other than that, like I love what I get to do. I mean, I'm basically learning something all the time and I'm just like teaching it back to people. So
Yeah.
pretty
And
cool.
and now, like, there's so much, I mean, you can learn, but you can learn it, interacting with people from all over the world. I mean, it's always fun on these streams to see where people are,
Yep.
saying hello from, joining in from, and there's so much, like, really deep interaction and exchanges of ideas. And it's incredible. I mean, this aspect of it didn't exist just even 15 years ago. I guess it kind of started, but not to this level. It's really incredible, or at least for me, it's newer. So
But
it's,
yeah,
yeah,
look, we have people from all over Croatia, India, Germany.
it's
Spencer's in
amazing.
Detroit. So,
Spencer's in
yeah,
Detroit.
this is great. Cool. I think so. We're going to get into Spring Modulith a little bit later, but I think maybe a good place to start is how we kind of got here. So, we've been like, for the longest time, we built these monolithic applications, right? And then this idea of microservices came around, and it's like, well, let's split everything up into microservices. And I'd like to get both your thoughts on this, but I feel like just starting there, like, I think, anytime something new comes in, we talked about learning new things, right? Anytime something new comes in, everybody's like jumps on the train and says, okay, it's all or nothing. Let's just build everything in microservices, right? And microservices definitely have their place and their advantage if you use them correctly. But do you feel like we got into a point where we just kind of did everything microservices and maybe kind of overused it? What have you guys seen in the industry?
I mean, I think so. I do think there's this aspect, as you're saying, where there was microservices. There was this explosion of microservices that started in the early 2010s, I guess,
Yep.
right? And I do think there was an over rotation, but partially just because the support for microservices was there, right? From everything from starting to incorporate your even like Spring Boot, right? Having Tomcat running inside of an application, that's one step. And then
That was just a big step by itself,
by
right?
itself was a huge step.
That was
Yeah,
huge.
absolutely. Yeah. And then, like, when you add the containerization and have the full, sort of production environment in a box, and then you have something like Kubernetes that allows you to do that at scale. So there was so much support. And then we had 12 factors. So there was architectural guidance, there was technical support for microservices to have this explosion. And monoliths weren't getting the same kind of attention and really like technical support for them.
Mm-hmm.
But as you're saying that, for me, and the reason that I kind of really really got interested in this project is going a little farther back. So as I mentioned, I have a background in consulting, and I remember, like, between 2000, I guess, 8 and 11 or so, doing consulting projects at companies that were doing service-oriented architecture. and how you could see that the development teams were trying to already bring these code organization ideas. And so they would structure their code, and they had different services that they were trying to connect through APIs and things like that, but they were still deployed as a single ear file, generally, right? So they didn't have the discipline and the technical support to be able to really bring those ideas, like be really disciplined about those ideas, avoid, cross calls between services in a code base, and they were still keeping things in a single code base. And then even if a development team were to hone these practices within themselves, when they packaged the application to deploy it, they were still, kind of all doing it at once. And so like there wasn't, I don't know, like the ideas were there. And so they went in the direction of microservices. And then, we found that we had, production problems with that. And so there was this kind of gap for years. And a couple of years ago, when I heard Oliver Drottbaum, who is on the Spring team, and he is the lead and the creator for Spring Modulith, when I finally sat down, I had heard him talking about this project that, Modulith, it sounded kind of interesting, this catchy name. And then when I actually sat down to listen to it, I was like, oh my God, I feel like this is the project I've been waiting for 10 years. Like I felt this hole here, this sort of discomfort of like, there is this over rotation into microservices, but we don't have the thing to counterbalance it to help us not over rotate. And like, here it is.
Because people like the idea of like modularizing things, right? That's why kind of microservices exploded. Like, hey, I have this one thing and it's going to do this one thing and this one thing only, and I can do there are a lot of pros to that. But what we found out is there's also a lot of cons to that, right? Building distributed architectures comes with its challenges. It's not an easy thing to do. And so I think a lot of people kind of went into that, saw a lot of the challenges it was creating and said, okay, maybe everything doesn't need to be a microservice. Maybe there are certain things that need to be their own service for whatever reason, maintainability, scalability, etc. But I like being in one code base for everything because it simplifies a lot of things, right?
Yeah. I'm seeing in that I'm just going to try to take off my AirPods without somebody saying that AirPods mic quality is not good. So I'm going to hope that this works. Give me 1 second.
All right.
We'll give it a try. We'll do it in production. What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah.
I got a new chair that's super squeaky.
Oh boy. I don't know. I thought Cora sounded okay to me. So.
Can you still hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay. All right. Let's check that. Okay.
Yeah. No, that sounds good.
Okay. So sorry.
No worries.
When we talk about Modulith, I always I have this guilt in the back of my head because I was the person that was coming from the Bay Enterprise where we had, dozens of engineers all doing microservices. And that was awesome because we had dozens of engineers and we weren't getting in each other's way. We had a new feature for the new thing and it could go kind of on its own path to production. But then when I left the big enterprise and I went to the small team that just had 3 engineers like what we have here, I brought all of that baggage with me and I said, no, microservices so that we don't step on each other. But there were just 3 of us. And it bit us. And it bit us in many, many ways. Not just like the cost of running that infrastructure, not just the production infrastructure, the non-production infrastructure. For each one of those microservices, there's networking concerns and repositories and all of that stuff that I did. I was the person. It was all my fault. So I have this guilt. I put all of that on the team.
Guilty. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the really important thing is to realize that like what's important are the architectural ideas of like functional decomposition, right? So there were kind of the important ideas are logical. And then whether you deploy that stuff in as one deployable artifact and it's a monolith, or you decide to break them up and they become microservices, that is a secondary technical detail, right? So our approach to architecture should be the same. So I think shed some of that guilt because in that were so many of the right ideas.
Right. Okay, so
thanks for letting me forgive myself a little bit.
Okay, so Spring Modulith came around, as you said. You heard about it. You started watching Ollie talk about it. You got really interested in it. For those who may have never heard of it, what is Spring Modulith? What is the purpose of this project?
So the purpose of this, I mean, Spring in general, right, is a framework that codifies best practices for whatever the project is. And most of Spring really addresses technical concerns, right? Integration, batch processing, whatever it is. Yeah. But it doesn't really guide you in terms of architectural ideas, right? You get inside your code and you're like, okay, so do I create a package of controllers, or do I create, how do I organize this stuff? How do I think about it? And generally, especially if you're doing microservices, it matters in some ways, but it doesn't really matter that much, because every microservice should be doing one thing, right? So then how it does its thing is like an encapsulation of however you want to implement that. But so one thing Modulith is trying to do is to bring a set of best practices, bring a set of opinions from the Spring team on how you should architect and organize your code for a monolith, meaning an application that does more than one thing. And each one of those things, instead of having to be a separate deployable, is just considered a logical module within the application.
And by the way, I love that about Spring. It doesn't force you into anything, right? Like, you can go in and create whatever package structure you want. You can organize your code however you want. But I also like being told what to do. Like, this is the best way to do it. Just follow this pattern, and things are going to work out okay for you.
I love being told what to do by the Spring team.
By the Spring team. That's the important part.
Yeah. Please tell me what to do.
Because I've seen this in other communities. Like, there's always big conversations in like the React community that it's not really a framework. It's just like a set of libraries, right? But then with that, you have all these different libraries for like state management or routing. And if you get into that world, you're like, well, I just want to know which one works the best and which one I should use. I don't want to have to go experiment with this for 10 years and try to figure that out. Like, just tell me which one to use, please.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I appreciate that.
And tell me how to use it. Right. So there's all these opinions, right? So the which and the how, right? So like the which is like, so these architectural ideas are codified, which also means, as with anything Spring, it also gives us like a common vocabulary, right? Then we're all on the same page when we talk about architecture. When it translates to an application, there's so much more common ground in how we communicate, right? So that's the opinions part. And then the other part is like to codify these things and to deliver them in terms of like actual technical support that will help you implement these and support you in production, right? So for example, right, it tells you that these ideas of what these modules are, what that is in a Spring Boot application. It means that your top level packages are your different modules within your monolith, right? So if you take a monolithic application and you logically decide, I'm going to functionally decompose it into these three different things that it should be doing, instead of creating three Spring Boot applications, you create three top level packages. And then the way that a Spring Boot application would normally start at the main Spring Boot application annotated class, and then from there scan your whole application for controllers or services or whatever, Spring Modulith will piggyback off of that capability and say, you know what, I'm going to scan each top level package separately, just by default, assume each one is a different module. And then from that, I can actually build this in-memory representation of your architecture as all of these modules. And I can provide support for making sure that you're not calling you're not making direct code calls from one to another beyond, let's say, that top level package, right? Everything in the top level package is the API you would expose if that were a microservice, and everything that's in a sub package is the internal implementation of what would be a separate microservice. So it's protecting your code beyond what the Java compiler could do on its own. So you can have all of these classes be public, and Java would let you make these cross package calls, but Modulith will say, actually, you can't make that call to this other module because you're calling a sub package, and that's the private implementation of that other module. So suddenly you have the things that microservices helped you with network hops. You're protected by Spring Modulith, and there's of course other support.
Right. So when we talk about like a module, is this if we're thinking in terms of like breaking our application up into microservices, is each module like a microservice in and of itself? Like this has to do with customers, or this has to do with orders, or this has to do with products. Whereas before I might have broken that into its own microservice. Is that now really just a module in a Spring Modulith app?
I mean, that is how I would think about it, because I mean, that's what I was saying to DaShaun, right? Like the when you think about, oh, we implemented this as microservices versus we didn't, the fact that you implemented it as microservices means you did that functional decomposition work, and that logical work should be the same. And then the decision of microservices or modulith can be secondary.
That's a big part on your approach on how we're going to market that functional decomposition, putting things into features. Because just because we were going down the microservice architecture and I had microservices, I overdid it there too. I had a microservice for this report and for this thing. So I was building things as like, oh, here's a new feature, but I wasn't doing it in the same domain where it should have been. So there was a point where we were like, oh, we're getting a little bit too big. And we realized that later, right? And what Modulith has done, it says like, hey, we understand you're going to run into these things. Let's start here. And now I think for me, and I think for a lot of us, starting with the Modulith is the right way to go. There's a question like, hey, so like when do you go to the microservice architecture?
I was going to bring that up.
Microservice, architecture has different benefits. And one of them is like when you're scaling things differently or when you're working on things differently. But Modulith also protects you in that you can not step on each other's toes, because if you're doing it properly, if you're putting these into modules, features as modules, then you can pull out that module, you can deploy it as a microservice. But that works both ways, right? I can pull those microservices back in and make those a module of something else.
And it's always easier to start with a monolith and then split those. It's much harder to start with this huge distributed system and then kind of wrangle everything back, right? And I think to that point of that question, what would be the use case for monolith versus microservice? I don't know. I don't remember who said this, but I think one of the big software engineers, maybe it was like Martin Fowler or something. It was like, it's much easier to start. I can't remember the quote. I'm going to butcher it, so I'm not even going to say it. But there are different use cases for this, right? And one of the things is like, if you notice that like one application, one piece of the application is scaling much more than the other parts, right? Maybe you need to throw a whole bunch of more servers or instances at this particular functionality, then maybe that's a microservice, so we can scale that independently. Maybe you find that one of your applications gets deployed way more than the other ones, right? So talk about like an application that had a front end and we're constantly working on the front end and deploying that. And we don't want to have to deploy our entire application with that. Maybe that's a reason to split it out. There are a whole bunch of really good books on microservices and when to use them. But always, if you don't know, start with a module and you can always move things out to kind of a microservice.
I like to say like starting with one is easier than starting with more. If I've got a user, an account, and a product, things, those are my domains. Like I can either deploy that one Modulith, that one app, or I have to deploy 3. And then if I'm going to have any kind of communication, I've got to, well, typically we were doing HTTP-based clients. So I had more code that I was having to do because they were microservices and they were only connected through HTTP. The other thing that this Modulith project is kind of pushing is kind of this event-driven, message-driven communication. And that alone reduces the amount of code that you're taking to production. That's cool, right?
Yeah.
Going to production with one, I have this application context, built in, but then I can easily extend it to other things.
Another comment I had here was from Wiz Carl Lenz. How big of an app do you have to start using a microservice or some sign to look for? I don't think size is really a question when it comes to microservices, right? Like it could be the biggest app in the world, it could be the smallest. I don't think there's a size that kind of indicates this needs to be a microservice. When we talked about those things, there's different things that you want to look at, like maintainability, scalability, deployability. Like when those questions start coming up and one slice of your application is acting different than the rest of that application, then I think that's a sign to start looking into microservices. But as DaShaun said, start with an app and those things will come up. You'll start to notice those different patterns.
There's multiple things to look for. Let's say that user account and product. If my product API is getting hit more than the others, and I'm at that point where I need to scale because we're not handling traffic, I can either deploy 2 of those modulists that has all the modules wrapped into it, or I can pull that product out and I can scale products separately. That's one side, looking at traffic, looking at performance. But the other side is also your team, right? Like Dan was talking about earlier, when one part of your application is being developed on a different life cycle, being developed differently, or in different regions of the world, there's 2 sides to look at. There's the technical side, and there's also the team. This is a big one of the benefits of microservice architecture is not just the technical, it's also the ability to scale and to deliver and roll forward or roll back applications independently.
It's crazy though, like how things change, because before there was Modulith, the reasons that we would have gone from a monolith to a microservice, I mean, first of all, you want code organization, you want different teams to work on different code bases to be able to not, like you say, not step on each other. You want to scale differently. If one thing crashes, you don't want other processes to crash. There were all these reasons that we wanted to move from traditional applications to microservices. And now that we've filled in this gap, we can reevaluate that list of motivators to moving to microservices and say, what can we accomplish staying within a monolith? So you can have that code organization where maybe, if we were all working on one code base and that code base had 3 modules in it, we wouldn't have, if we just kept it in the same Git repo. Now, if we're just disciplined about, you work on this package, you work on that package, I work on this other package, we're really not going to be stepping on each other with our Git commits. So that team agility, that's still could be a motivator, but you can be a lot more specific and selective if you're working on app and you're like, it really is becoming a bother for us that it's all in one Git repo, then okay, split something out. But maybe you won't get there because now we have this discipline, right? And even Modulith now is adding the ability to run tests for one module
slice.
Module changes exactly, then it can optimize tests, so it only runs a test for that, or you can control it. So that becomes less of a problem, right? And then the other interesting thing is, so the reasons that remain, the most compelling reasons that remain are the ability to, as you've been saying, to scale one module independently. And maybe the fault tolerance one, like if one process falls, you don't want the whole application to fall. But as these improvements, as Java efficiency, now we have things that start up faster, things that use less memory footprints. So now, do you really care that you're deploying a bigger application? Do you need to split it up? Like, what do you save? Maybe just deploy the whole thing, and if you need to scale one thing, you scale everything, because the amount of memory that you need to scale something that now uses 1/10 of the memory that it used before all these Java efficiency improvements, maybe you don't care anymore. Maybe the infrastructure savings of scaling that one thing separately are not there, right? Why do you want to scale that one thing separately? Are you being driven by infrastructure costs? So maybe that's not an issue anymore. So
you open the door to one of my favorite conversations. My children will never deploy active passive, right? If I'm deploying things to 2 different regions, if I've got 12 microservices deploying to 2 different regions, that adds up. No matter how you're deploying it as functions, as apps, that adds up. But if it's a monolith deploying to 2 different regions, that makes a whole lot of sense. I can deploy that to 5 regions and still be less than deploying 12 microservices to 2 different regions. And also the cognitive overhead of understanding the architectures, right? When things are in a monolith, it's a whole lot easier to get your head wrapped around it. There's a good question here from Dragos. Like, how do you communicate between modules? Do modules have transactions?
You can communicate. So as DaShaun mentioned, you can communicate, using HTTP API, direct API calls from by default a top level package to a top level package class to a top level package class. But what Modulith provides support for, and sort of by de facto encourages it, is for messages to go from one module to another using messaging. And so if you were using microservices, you would install Kafka or Rabbit or JMS or something like that and actually send messages through this external infrastructure. But Spring Framework itself has an internal broadcasting system, right? It has a messaging system built in. So between modules, Spring Modulith gives you the annotations to quickly configure. When you create an event that will be the event that's published from one module and subscribed to by the other. And just with some simple annotations, Spring Modulith will set up the Spring messaging framework so that you have the messaging infrastructure in memory in your application with all of the correct configuration to manage transactionality in the proper way. Yeah. And then if you want to decide to externalize those two, to separate one of the modules into a microservices, then it also has an annotation that will very easily help you just transition to using Rabbit or Kafka or JMS instead of the internal messaging. Or you can use that if you simply need your modulith to publish something for some other external system as well. So yes, it has this very specific support for messaging, because that requires configuration of the internal Spring Framework messaging, but you can also make direct calls or use HTTP.
I have a couple of questions that are kind of related. One, why use Spring Modulith versus Gradle modules that expose Spring auto configuration? So the idea of like a Gradle module, and then the other one was like, hey, does Modulith use Java modules? So when we talk about modules, this is specific to Spring Modulith. This has nothing to do with like a Gradle module or a Java module, right?
Yeah, and it's not dependent on Gradle or Maven. So if you were to switch between Gradle or Maven, you would lose all your modular setup, right, that you use. So this is really internal to the Spring Boot application. I don't think that they're even mutually exclusive. This is just sort of like this internally architectural support that you have. Because also beyond that, the build system modular support is for build and packaging. Spring Modulith has things like observability, tracing, and what am I blanking on? There's a bunch of stuff, right? There's it visualizes, it'll produce documentation for you on what's architecturally important about your application. It'll help you run tests more efficiently. It does other things, right? And it'll verify your code that you're not making calls that are not allowed by Modulith between modules. So it does more. And then if you have a use case for it, you can still use your build system.
And it's not just about separating your code, which is kind of more what the build system does, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
Lots of good questions.
One customer came up to me after when was it? I think it was at Spring One, I guess, in Vegas last August. And because the use case generally is like, if you're starting an app, start with a modulith, and then when you get to the point that you really need to break something out, then break it out. But in the meantime, just work on this one code base. But the reverse case is also valid, right? For companies who have over rotated, as DaShaun, you could give your old team a call if you're still feeling guilty, and they could go in reverse, take your microservices and copy them into one Git repo. Each one is a different top level package. And then the other, I think, really great thing is that once you have the code bases once you have your different modules in one code base, then if you need to refactor your microservices, it's really hard if they're in different Git repos. But if they're in one Git repo and all you're doing is moving a class from one package to another, and then you've properly refactored your code, it becomes really easy to refactor. So that's a huge advantage. And then I would even go from there to say that there's a lot of code bases. There was a lot of modernization of legacy monoliths that's been happening over the last, I guess, 10, 15 years. But there's some legacy applications that are just, they don't have development going on, or they're just so old, or they're just kind of like they've always been on the back burner that we don't have the resources to address that one. That's too messy or too risky or whatever. And now with Spring Modulith, you can take that code base. You can actually annotate your old code under a package and say, like, to Modulith, say, don't look over here, and then just start to move code into new packages as you refactor in the same code base. So you can have legacy code coexisting with your refactored Modulith code. And so it opens the doors to much more easily start to refactor all of those monoliths that we didn't want to touch.
And microservices, right?
Pattern.
Yeah, the Spring Modulith package, one of the things that it's using under the covers is Arch Unit, where it can say like, hey, yeah, here's some rules for how we want to interact. There's a comment in here about like using gRPC instead of messaging. All valid. But in my head, if I'm using gRPC, that's more code that I have to write. At any scale, if I'm doing gRPC or HTTP, that's more code that I have to write. I love the idea that Spring Modulith being event-driven, I've simplified my code base, right? When I've got RabbitMQ as my means of communicating, that's a whole lot easier to write. And then the next question, or from the same person, is recently I've been thinking about podulets, co-located microservices in the same pod. There's no value add. If you've got Spring Modulith in one hand, where you can have your applications communicating, doesn't have to be gRPC, doesn't have to be, you can use it in, those modules can be in the same application context, in the same JVM. Spring provides you a mechanism for communicating across applications. You have an event-driven mechanism inside of the Spring application context. So you get that. So you don't have to have co-located podulets and dealing with that interconnection between different microservices in the same pod. So that's just my opinion. But this whole upgrading and maintenance, yes, we've got customers. I've worked with customers where they're on one side, they've got this monolith that they're like, hey, we're not sure where we can touch and we're afraid to do this maintenance, but we also don't know where we can deploy it. Spring Modulith, the architecture rules, you can add it to that legacy monolith and it'll help you paint the picture. Because again, you talked about it generating documentation. It helps paint the picture on where is my pain point? Where am I doing the most things wrong? Where might I find the most benefit? That's a super huge value. But the other side of that, I always use the term feature complete application that's been running in production. It was delivered as 12 microservices, but now it's in maintenance mode. So somewhere somebody's maintaining, instead of one repository, they're maintaining 12 repositories. You also indirectly talked about the need of upgrading and staying on the latest and greatest. What's easier, doing maintenance on one repository or doing maintenance on 12? But it doesn't stop there. That feature complete thing, yeah, it's running in production. It's making you a lot of money, but it's also, you have 12 things, 12 logical units that you're having to communicate back and forth, right? And that introduces a lot of other issues. Oh, are they okay if one of the zones goes away? You have a lot of things to think about when you're in a microservice architecture, especially for that feature complete application is not getting regular maintenance. Doing the maintenance is a big piece, right? Pulling those microservices into a module, there's tons of value there. And we do have customers that are taking that approach, pulling those feature complete microservice architectures into a monolith and making it easier for them going forward.
I think what it goes back to me, like listening to both of you talk about this, is like I feel like people just like are finding issues that are non-issues. Like, going back to everybody's just deploying microservices. Like, why? Did they ever stop to ask, like, why are we doing this? I like the idea that both of you said is like starting with a module, building the application, deploying the application, and then taking a look at it, observing it. What's going on in our application? Oh, this piece is getting hit way more than other pieces, or this thing needs to be deployed way more than other pieces. All right, now you have a problem to solve for instead of just inventing these problems.
Or you really need to deploy this functionality, or you really need to implement this functionality using a different technology.
Yeah,
this has to be written in some other tech, right? Then it has to be separate. There are legit cases.
Yep. Cool.
Absolutely. The maintenance and tracking. This is Baba's comment. Oh, yeah. Maintenance and tracking flow through microservices is a nightmare. Spring Modulith addresses that as well. It gives you that observability and traceability inside of your Modulith, so you can see where the pain is.
In onboarding new developers, I mean, here, go study these 20 repositories.
Or 100, right?
Or 100,
we work with customers that have hundreds of repositories making up that big A app, their flagship thing, and there are hundreds.
Yeah.
And imagine going there and onboarding there. That's
so maybe like another reason to deploy something separately is like it's really part of a shared part of an architecture versus like, then you have like your functional decomposition maybe at the microservice level where they just become modules in a modulith. But then there's like one level up, functional of like, this is shared by these 5 teams, but then each team has its own thing, and maybe the shared thing is separate, right? Like there's other reasons that you might want to separate things physically. But
yeah,
like it's memory.
Not always. Oh yeah, memory. Yeah, and it's not always just like code repositories, right? When we get into like distributed architectures, we probably have configuration repos. We probably have a gateway somewhere. We probably have all these other things that come into play when you start building distributed architectures. So those onboarding documents get really, really long.
There's a couple of questions about memory. I don't know if it's from the same person or not, but like your memory concerns are still going to be the same. The difference here is where is my memory going? If I'm doing gRPC calls or HTTP calls to a bunch of other things, depending on the size of the object and the type of the object, it doesn't take more than one microservice to cause problems on the memory side. You still have to do that work. You still have to evaluate which garbage collector is going to work for your application. But Spring Modulith isn't doing anything magic to reduce memory footprint or
it's
highlight.
Just a Spring Boot app.
Yep.
It's another Spring Boot app. Yeah.
Yep. But as Cora said earlier, we have these tools now. We can build smaller images. We can take up less memory. We can use things like virtual threads if we need to talk to a database. We're no longer blocking that thread.
Right. So your app can handle more
less resources. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. You know what? Database connectivity being one of the things that cause scale issues.
Yeah.
Right? If I had even read and write data stores, I had, hey, this data store is for my reads, this one over here is for my write. All the different ways that we've struggled to handle scale. And with those monolithic applications, now that we've got virtual thread support and Spring Modulith, man, I'm just thinking back to all the times where that would have been really powerful. That would have been a nice...
You're reading from products and orders, but in the same one, maybe we don't read from customers as much, whatever the case may be. Like that's another reason we might have split things out in the past, because that one particular set of query operations were just halting the system, right? And now I don't think that's as much of an issue. So another question. What are the best practices for integrating a front end with multiple microservices?
Gateway. Use a gateway. Gateway. Use a gateway. Use a gateway. Did you hear? Use a gateway.
But now, do we still use a gateway if we're using a module? Probably, right?
You can.
Yeah, I mean, you can.
And why would you
have all those concerns in one place? Because at one point, as we said, maybe not right away, but at one point, maybe we do split a couple services out from this Modulith. And now we want a single entry point into that application or applications. So probably.
And I realize I'm in this spot where that is my default. My default for everything is I want a gateway for my big A app. I want a gateway for a bunch of reasons, because I don't want to have to deal with Azure front door. I don't want to have to deal with an F5. If I've got a gateway, I can handle my routing for my big A app in my big A app. The other piece is the security slicing. I can have that gateway say, hey, you need to be authorized to access this endpoint. I can do that in my gateway. It simplifies so many of those things. And then I could go into like all the deployment patterns. I can have a canary deploy, and I can use my gateway to route traffic to 10% over this way. I have all of my different load balancing mechanisms that I can plug into my gateway. A gateway for me, even if I'm using a Modulith, a gateway for me is kind of it's like a key. When I go to production, I want a gateway for my big app, for every big app, whether it's a Modulith, microservice, or monolith.
And if you're going to use a gateway, you might as well use Spring Cloud Gateway. So.
You might as well. I mean, it's just right there.
Spring Cloud Gateway as an OAuth client, forwarding to your Modulith.
Yep.
Love it.
It's a good place to start.
All the things.
I'm sure there's an authorization server somewhere. So
right, exactly. Right. Yeah, exactly. Your gateway's talking to your gateway OAuth client, talking to your Spring OAuth server. There was actually there was an info key. I'm looking at it here on my screen, but Ollie pointed this out to me. Which was an InfoQ survey from 2022, where they have the graphs that up and down the sort of like the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority,
Yes.
and the late majority. So in the late majority, microservices are already in the late majority. So one step back from that, in the early majority are modular monoliths, right? So that's so like modular.
That's awesome.
Type stuff. But in that same bucket, in the early majority, lagging behind microservices and like parallel to Modulith, is an entry that says correctly built distributed systems.
Yeah.
So exactly, like all these things we learned from microservices. I mean, it's great, right? We learned all these things from microservices, and now we can sort of take a step back and say, because of those lessons, we've developed this new support for our applications, and we can take those ideas and move forward in this improved way.
I love that the idea of modular monoliths is there. I don't have a great sense, but do you guys know, are other languages and frameworks kind of picking up on this as well?
Yes. Yes.
All right.
The answer is yes.
DaShaun said yes. I believe you.
Yeah. But I'll still say, just on my perception, is that Spring Modulith is doing a little more with the architectural guidance. Yes, deploying a modular monolith. There was another question about the Modulith versus microprofiles. Microprofile was designed for a microservice architecture, but it came out of the need of the Jakarta EE stack, right? But it still allowed you to pull all those things back into an ear file and deploy that monolithic ear file. Like we've always been able to do that with this microservice architecture, deploying a bunch of WAR files inside of an ear file, have a different context for each microservice. That's okay. But the guidance here is, it goes beyond that. It goes beyond just like how you're communicating, how you're deploying. There's also the safety and the recommended using the event-driven approach, making sure that you're not injecting something from that other package that's there today because everything's public, but it might not be there once you've pulled it out into a microservice, even though you could still do that.
Yeah, I think you mentioned earlier ArcUnit, and so I think so two technical sort of foundational pieces that made Modulith possible are, of course, Spring Boot with this ability to scan code and then saying, okay, instead of scanning the whole app, or in addition to scanning the whole app, we're also going to scan by top level package and add support for modules individually. And then what DaShaun mentioned was ArcUnit. So to your question, Dan, so ArcUnit is basically a tool for writing rules to control, evaluate the architecture of your application, architectural level rules. And there are different projects that do this. And ArcUnit, which was created in 2017, was what was appealing to Ollie and why he used ArcUnit when he created Spring Modulith is that ArcUnit was very sort of like plain Java. He wanted the most like plain Java approach to being able to write architectural rules. And so so to your question, Dan, about like, are there other, I mean, since 2017, I imagine, I don't know that much about other frameworks in particular and what they're doing, but there are tools definitely for writing rules to evaluate architecture. But Spring Modulith in the way that Spring does is it's not just about providing a tool that does that, but baking in opinions. So it's an opinionated implementation of using ArcUnit for architectural rules, and based on Spring Boot applications, and then of course adding all this other support continuously to improve, to make it easier for you to design and get to production and maintain in production.
Cool. And then we had a question, best practices on Spring Modulith already available. Is it already GA? So yes, current version, somebody put in the chat, 1.3.1. So it is GA. So if folks want to get started with Spring Modulith, what's the easiest way to do this?
There's the documentation. There's some sample apps out there. Oliver maintains one called Spring RESTbucks in particular. That's probably a good reference application to go to. The documentation is good. There's a bunch of talks if you Google on how to do it. It's pretty straightforward.
You have a couple.
Yeah. I did a keynote.
I could think of Spring IO last year. Yeah.
yeah, I think that was a good sort of summary of like the top level features that were available at the time. Now there's like some new stuff to support like testing of modules more efficiently or in a more targeted way. But yeah, just create an app.
Spring.io, is that a good place to go?
Start.spring.io is always the great place to go.
You could pick Spring Modulith from there. And what does that give us out of the box? Does that kind of give you the organization now? It's telling you like, hey, this is where you should start to put things, create modules, put things that are related to that module in those packages, that kind of thing.
So you would say, yeah. So if you create your Spring Boot application, what you would want to do is create literally you start to code. And so you name your top level package instead of calling it controllers, call it, if you have a customer's functional module and you have a orders module, call your top level package customers, call your top level package orders. If you have these Modulith starter in your POM file or your Gradle file, then automatically, that will be incorporated. And what the other thing that Spring Modulith aims to do is not to be invasive into your production code. So I would say like if you have an application today that is kind of modularized like that, then go ahead and add Spring Modulith. And so the ability to evaluate your architecture and tell you if you are having a violation is done through tests. So you would go to your test package, write a test. You create. It's just a few lines of code. You'll find it in the Spring Modulith documentation, and you basically have it create an in-memory model of your architectural model, and then you run a command called verify. And if your code is not violating any Spring Modulith opinions, implemented as Arcunate rules, then your test will pass. And if your test fails, it'll tell you your orders module is trying to call your inventory module code in a way that violates, right, in a sub package, for example, by default. I always say by default, because if you want to expose something in a sub package, if you want to do something different, Spring always gives you ways to go away from the defaults. But the default is that you can't call something in a sub package. So if you're doing that in your code, Modulith will tell you, and then you can reevaluate your code and move things around or decide to implement things through messaging or however you want to do it.
I love this idea. And I think this is like, if you're working in a company and you want a way to like stand out, go take like one of your applications, move it into Modulith, write some of these tests that kind of show some of the problems with your current architecture, and go back to the team and say, hey, look, over the weekend or a couple nights last week, I was able to put this together and found some holes in our architecture that Spring Modulith was able to kind of point out for us. So I love that, and it's kind of low-hanging fruit, right? Like you're not recreating the world. You're just bringing this into a project and pointing out a couple things. So I think that's a really good for something that you could do pretty quickly, actually.
Yeah, and then let us know.
Yeah.
Let us know what you thought.
Absolutely.
Or if you have questions, we're here.
Cora, if I'm not planning to build a Modulith, I'm just building a microservice. I'm just building that user service. Why would I grab Spring Modulith just to build my user service?
If you only have one service in there, like truly one service, I don't know that you need it. I think once you add another one, or unless I'm not thinking of a use case where you would want it for just one, if you only had one service, I guess it's once you add the second one. Yeah, am I missing? Am I not thinking of something?
There will always be another one.
Yeah, I still grab it because I like the documentation that it generates. I like the architecture guidance that it gives me out of the box, even if it's just for my user service. I still get those pretty docs. I still get the verification. Hey, this is public. It shouldn't be. I still get that. So I still grab it. Maybe I shouldn't.
Yeah. No, I think wouldn't it only be if you have a second? I mean, your documentation would have one.
Yeah, just got one box. That's okay.
Yeah.
Right? That's okay. I get it. Right. I also like to use Spring REST docs, but yeah, it's just another piece that I can add.
Yeah.
I guess we could probably spend another hour on this, but to kind of close this out, when I start building my Modulith application, the question always comes up of like, what belongs in a module? And I don't know if we get into like domain domain-driven design, or like how do I figure out what goes in there? Like, what are your thoughts or approaches on like what goes into a specific module?
Wait, sorry. Before I go there, I just wanted to say to DaShaun, I thought maybe like, if I were writing a one modulith, or like a microservice with a modulith in there, and I wanted to publish an event, and I could just annotate my event as add externalized, and it publishes the to Rabbit. Like maybe that would be a case. I have to think about it a little more. It's a little less boilerplate code, but I have to think about whether there's any reason.
Yeah, just to encourage my event driven.
Yeah.
Planning for the future.
So sorry, Dan. Oh my gosh, my memories. What did you just say?
Modules. How do you design your modules? Like
how do you
decide into a modules? And I know that this is could be an in-depth question.
With or without I mean, I think that's sort of
DDD.
Yeah, DDD.
And this is the first time that we're saying DDD, and we're an hour in. But that's the other piece is this Spring Modulith really aligns itself well with domain-driven design.
Yeah.
Like all of that guidance, all those rules. It's easy to implement. So there's the other piece. What's the other framework that we pull in that has the domain-driven annotations in it?
Oh, J molecules.
J molecules, yes. That's also a part of Spring Modulith that we haven't talked about. But when you're developing using domain-driven design, it lends itself really nicely to a Spring Modulith project.
I'm trying to see if I can find it. There was actually this. Oh, here it is. There was when I was first kind of like diving into Spring Modulith, I found there was just in one of the GitHub issues on the repo, there was it had nothing to do with the actual like technical thing that was being dealt with in the issue. But somebody, Marco Reitano, if you're listening, I don't know him, but that was the person who commented. This is from October of 2023. And so he wrote, he said, "Hi, Oliver, confirm the snapshot fixes the issue." But then he said, "On a side note, thanks for your work with Spring Modulith. I'm exploring it in my master thesis, and it prompted me to reread the domain-driven design red book. Working with Spring Modulith in combination with what you just mentioned, DaShaun, J molecules, which is the annotations that are much more architectural driven than the technical annotations that we tend to use in Spring, greatly improved my understanding of consistency boundaries, aggregate module design, domain events, etc. Something that I was, and I love this part, something that I was always unsure of, even in a microservice context, resulting in dependency hell, distributed big ball of mud in the past, which is, like domain-driven design can kind of be a beast, right? You never quite know if you're doing it right. Hence the question, right? It's a great question. And like, I don't know what DDD, but I don't know if you're doing your DDD right. Like that's a little trial and error and experience. And so to think that Spring Modulith also makes it easier to get better at domain-driven design, I think that, like, to me, that's like really beautiful and amazing.
That's awesome.
Greg, I see your comment there about the next evolution, having something that can pull out a module. There's a project called Spring CLI that I use a lot to pull in modules into a project. I use the Spring Boot add. I can point it to a project and I can pull it in for that use case where I've got the 12 microservices and I want to bring them into a single repository and easier maintenance. And there is there's a need for a Spring Boot extract module. But I don't know if it'd be a Maven or a Gradle plugin. I'm kind of leaning into this Spring CLI approach to do that. But I like where your head's at. We're on the same page. Thank you for that comment.
Time flies when you're talking tech with friends. Wow. Look at that. An hour has just gone by. We just started. I told you it would. It always does. Cora, we really, really want to thank you for coming on the show today and sharing your wisdom with us. I will get some things in the show notes, but if people want to get in touch with you after the show, where can they find you?
I'm still on the X app and
Twix. I call it Twix.
Twix. That's probably the place that I would see faster. Yeah.
And that's the handle right there at
everywhere. Right. Wherever I am, that's my handle.
C Iberkleid. All right.
Yeah. Or LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, whatever people want.
Perfect. All right. Well, again, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much,
conversation.
Thank you
to everyone who joined us in the live chat, and thanks for all the wonderful questions. With that, DaShaun and I will be at DevNexus next week, and we will have a live episode. So if you're there, come check us out. Thanks, everyone.